Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. I was doing my usual scan through social media to see if there was any Browns news. And I came across this tweet from Ben Axelrod. And I considered quote tweeting it and replying there and getting into it with him there, but I didn't think that, a venue like Twitter would be a good place to have this conversation. So I decided to make this a video because I found a lot of problems with this tweet and with what Ben has been pushing from what I could tell on his Twitter, which is the Browns should take a quarterback just because they need a quarterback at number 2 overall, which is not an uncommon opinion. There are plenty of Browns fans who have that opinion, and I don't think that that opinion is stupid. I do think there are problems with that opinion once we consider the larger context of what this draft actually has to offer. But let's read Ben's tweet here. He says, nobody advocating for the Browns to pass on a quarterback at 2 has offered an actual viable alternative for what the Browns should do at the quarterback position instead. And they'll also be the first to dunk on them if Cam Ward or Shedeur becomes a star somewhere else. So one, the whole second part there where he's like trying to paint everybody who doesn't want the Browns to draft a quarterback as like some kind of spineless person who's also going to be mad and turn around at the Browns are doing that. I don't really care for that whole part. That's just kind of useless gesturing there. But let's talk about the first part of that, right? Nobody advocating for the Browns to pass on the quarterback has offered an actual viable alternative. Now, that is a very subjective statement said as if it is fact. And the reason I have a problem with that is, what is a viable alternative? And who gets to decide, more importantly, what a viable alternative looks like? Because somebody could say to me, hey, Kirk Cousins is a viable alternative to drafting a quarterback in this year's draft. And I might agree with that. But you might not agree with that. You might not think that Kirk Cousins is a viable alternative. Like, what is that? What kind of bar is that to measure it on? It's a very subjective bar that you get to decide, which means nobody has convinced you, Ben Axelrod, that there is a better option at quarterback. Because also, like, who's to say that Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders are going to be any good? Right, we're kind of just assuming that as well in the framing of the way that he put this question. And I think that's incorrect too, not because his opinion on Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders is wrong, but at this point, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders are unknowns. You cannot treat them as if they are knowns, especially when there's not a large consensus in the draft community about those two prospects in the same way that there was consensus about somebody like Andrew Luck, or, you can go on the list of guys there was consensus about, right? The Caleb Williams, Drake May, same thing, Jaden Daniels, right? So that does not exist for Cam Ward. That does not exist for Shedeur Sanders. So the whole framing of this question kind of falls apart once you actually evaluate it. And that's kind of the issue that I have with this argument. It's a lot of people arguing for the Browns to take a quarterback because they want to feel better about quarterback, not necessarily because the options that are presented to them in the draft are better. There's another part to this, the way that this is framed, that I find to be untrue. This question is framed, or at least this statement is framed, as if it is absolutely 100% necessary for the Cleveland Browns to find a long-term solution at the quarterback position this offseason. I don't find that to be true. If there's a long-term option available, absolutely go for it. 100%. I'm in agreement. But if there is not a long-term option available in the eyes of the people making these decisions, then they should not try to force a long-term option to be available. Ultimately, I don't know how the Cleveland Browns front office feels about Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. They may love Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. They may hate Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. They may think that these guys are the second coming. They might think that these guys are nothing. Have no idea where they sit on it, right? Me personally, my personal opinion, let me make that clear. I don't think that either of these guys are going to be top level tier one franchise quarterbacks in the same way that we talk about like Justin Herbert or, some CJ Stroud, right? Like they're not going to be that level of quarterback. I think they're likely to be at best guys who can hover around tier three with maybe a couple of seasons that vacation in tier two as quarterback, right? So maybe they're tier three guys, good starters. Sometimes they have a couple of seasons that feel like franchise, and I think that's the best possible case scenario. I don't think it's the most likely scenario for those guys, but if that's what the ceiling is on those two prospects, and ultimately I don't find that ceiling being reached to be likely enough, especially with the Cleveland Browns organization, the way that we're set up. I don't think we're really great fits for Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. I don't think that Shedeur fits this offense. I don't think that Cam Ward really fits this offense well. And that being the case, I don't think we're going to get the ceiling out of those guys. And if you get anything less than the ceiling with those guys, then you just wasted your time. So that is why I don't think going for a quarterback at 2 is a great idea, because I think it's more possible you can get more value over time with just getting a really good player. And this goes to kind of the quarterback-centric way of thinking about things. A lot of people who work in the media in football think this way. A lot of people who talk about football or just watch football think this way. And it's because we're conditioned to feel this way, right? It's a quarterback-centric marketing plan from the NFL. It's a quarterback-centric league. We get told time and time again. And that is why guys like Tua Tagovailoa get $60 million in free agency, even though we all know that he's not that good of a quarterback. He's just good enough to start. So I'm not going to blame anybody for being super quarterback-centric for how they think about the game and the position. It's been drilled into you that quarterbacks are important. And I think that is true to a certain caliber of quarterback, right? If we're talking about a team that has an elite quarterback, yes, everything needs to flow around that quarterback. If we're talking about a team that has a franchise quarterback, yes, everything needs to flow around that quarterback. But if we're talking about a team that has anything less than that at the quarterback position, then the quarterback position becomes significantly less important than it does when you don't have one of those things. Look, the Browns have made the playoffs twice with Kevin Stefanski. Both the times they did it, they didn't have franchise quarterbacks. You can have success in the NFL without a quote-unquote elite or franchise quarterback. Now, can you win the Super Bowl without that? Those results are a little bit more mixed. It's not exclusive that you can't win a Super Bowl without a franchise quarterback. There have been teams that have done it before recently, but it is not easy to do that, right? And if you're talking about going all in and doing all of that, doing that without a quarterback is a problem. But if we're talking about just trying to have a good season, which the Cleveland Browns are at, right? It may be your desire for the Browns to draft a quarterback isn't necessarily about your desire for the Browns to have a decent season or a winning record next year. It's more about your concern about the Browns answering the quarterback problem. But it's important to remember, in order to solve your quarterback problem, you not only need to draft a quarterback, but you need to draft a quarterback that you really, really, really believe in order to invest the amount of time that a franchise has to invest to get that quarterback where that quarterback needs to get to. If you don't feel like one of those guys are there in that draft class, you're just wasting your time trying to force it to happen, right? You wouldn't propose to somebody that you didn't love because you know that a marriage with a person you don't love would be a waste of time. Why would you draft the quarterback, do the NFL franchise equivalent of proposing to them if you don't love them? And that's my issue with a lot of these arguments about why the Browns must take a quarterback, is because it's saying that, hey, it doesn't matter if these guys are great prospects. It doesn't matter if you love these prospects or if the Browns love them. They need a quarterback. They got to take a swing at one, so they must draft one. That's basically advocating for the Browns to make the oldest mistake in the book. You want to sign a quarterback to a short-term deal in free agency to start for a couple of years. That's not a commitment that's going to destroy you, whether it works out or whether it doesn't work out. But if you draft a quarterback at number 2 and that quarterback does not work out, that is a commitment that you have to spend 3 to 5 years seeing if it works out. People who want to advocate for drafting a quarterback right now love to bring up the success stories. Jaden Daniels worked out. Look at what it did for the Washington Commanders. But do we want to talk about how damaging these failures have been? How the New York Giants are still trying to recover from the failure of Daniel Jones, how the New York Jets are still reeling from the failure of Zach Wilson, how the Pittsburgh Steelers still have not found their ground from drafting Kenny Pickett. And that doesn't even bring up the fact that the Washington Commanders didn't draft Jaden Daniels because, damn, they just needed to get a quarterback, so they just took one. They drafted Jaden Daniels because they legitimately thought he was one of the best players in that draft. That's the position they were in, to change their franchise, and that's what the draft had to offer them. That is not this year's draft. We got to come to reality with that. We got to come to grips with that. We can't manufacture this into being something that it's not. We tend to look at this quarterback situation as if the Browns must find a long-term solution in this offseason no matter what. That is not the case. Right? There are some years where you cannot find a long-term solution at a position and you just get somebody who could be a stopgap, right? There's no long-term answer at left tackle. Let's just get a veteran in there to plug the hole while we wait for some options to pop up because we don't want to blow a bunch of money on somebody we don't think is going to be a long-term solution. This is the Tobias Harris problem. Right? The Philadelphia 76ers traded a bunch of capital back when they were in their peak competing days to go after Tobias Harris because they needed somebody who they felt like they could market as a third star. Now, Tobias Harris was never a third star of any team, right? Tobias Harris was always a solid player. But the Philadelphia 76ers needed somebody to feel like they had a big three. So they went and they tried to manufacture it with Tobias Harris. And that dug the Philadelphia Sixers into such a deep hole that they're still trying to dig themselves out of. Don't Tobias Harris yourself. If there is a problem that you can't solve this offseason because the talent is just not there, you cannot manufacture it to happen, right? If there was a top 5 quarterback in this draft class that I felt good about, not even great, just good about, I would be pounding the table saying we got to give it a shot. We got to see what this guy has, right? Like, I would want the Browns to draft the quarterback if there was one available, but you can't manufacture one. And I feel like right now, what we're trying to do, and I say we as in the media, the people who cover the Cleveland Browns on a daily basis, we are trying to convince ourselves that there's a quarterback. There's a long-term answer available. We are trying to avoid missing out. And also, I think at the end of Ben's tweet, he projects something here, right? He says they'll also be the first to dunk on the Browns if Cam Ward or Shador becomes a star somewhere else. Now, I don't know who he's talking about. If I say all summer, I don't want the Browns to draft Cam Ward or Shador Sanders, and the Browns don't draft Cam Ward or Shador Sanders, and one of those guys become really good, then I'll be like, nah, I understood why they wouldn't do that. I think he's kind of projecting something that he feels himself, which is he doesn't want to miss out on a quarterback. And he's willing to draft somebody he doesn't believe in to make sure that he doesn't have that fear of missing out. Because I think that's what's driving a lot of people to want a quarterback. It's fear of missing out. What if this guy's good? It's usually the argument I hear, right? Could the Browns afford to pass on the quarterback if a quarterback's really good? I think that's what's driving this, right? It's the fear of missing out. People don't want to miss on another draft pick. People don't want to see a quarterback go by. But it's not really about how we feel about these quarterbacks at the top of these drafts. And I would like to say this. Remember, in the draft, you're drafting prospects. You're not drafting hope. You're drafting guys with tape, a background, and things that they have done, a record that you can compare against other prospects and talk about what those prospects were able to do based on historical data. It's not close your eyes, spin around 3 times and flip a coin and then boom, that's your draft pick. There is a process at play that has worked for a lot of teams for a very long time. There is information available. You're drafting prospects. You're not drafting hope. And when you go into a draft trying to draft hope, you usually end up with nothing, right? Browns tried to draft some hope in 2014, swinging at hope with Justin Gilbert. Not because they thought he was one of the best players in that draft class. They didn't even come to interview him or do any kind of research on Justin Gilbert. Why? Because Mike Pettin wanted a corner, so they took a corner. They were hoping that Justin Gilbert would be good. They didn't know. They didn't do the work. They didn't research him and treat him as a prospect. Same thing goes with Johnny Manziel. Why did the Browns draft Johnny Manziel? A bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with research and looking into his background. They hoped that Johnny Manziel could bring that electricity to Cleveland. When you hope, you miss. These are prospects. There's a time and place for hope, but this ain't it. You can't go to the draft and start taking prospects off pure hope. And that is what this is. Because as easy as Ben can say, nobody advocating for the Browns to pass on a quarterback at 2 has offered an actual viable alternative for what the Browns should do at quarterback instead. Even though I don't think that's true. I think there are some viable alternatives. You could throw out Sam Darnold. I know he thinks that's unrealistic, but that's yet to be seen. But Kirk Cousins is certainly a viable alternative if he becomes available, the same way that there are other viable alternatives based on what you want the Browns to achieve this year. The second part to this is, are we convinced that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward are viable alternatives to fix the Browns' problems? Because I'm not convinced, right? And this goes back to subjectivity of what is a viable alternative and who's making that determination. If you have looked at these prospects and you've watched Cam Ward play, if you've watched Shedeur Sanders play, and you say, hey, I just want them because I think they're one of the best players in this draft, I got no problem with that. It is different than what I think, but I got no problem with that, right? And if you're telling me that Shedeur Sanders, he has the eye discipline to be a franchise quarterback, he has the accuracy to be a franchise quarterback, his arm strength is on, like, if you can't sell me on drafting a prospect based on the positive traits that that prospect brings to the table, but instead feel the need to sell drafting that prospect based on the idea of missing out instead of selling what you think is good about these quarterbacks, it tells me a lot about what you think about those quarterbacks. Because if these quarterbacks were really, really good, you wouldn't be arguing the Browns need to draft the quarterback just to draft the quarterback's sake. You would be arguing the Browns need to get this dude because he's going to be great. And this is going to solve one of our bigger problems. That is the test for me with quarterbacks and how people feel about it. And right now with Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, I'm not impressed with what I've seen on tape, at least impressed on the level of taking them number 2 overall. And I haven't heard the people who want the Browns to do this even attempt to try to sell me this based on football. It's based on like fear of missing out. It's based on what ifs and what are people going to say about you. It's a bunch of emotional reasons why people want to draft the quarterback, not necessarily reasons about the quarterbacks themselves. And that to me is a huge red flag. Again, if your process takes you there, if you look at these quarterbacks and you say, I want these guys because look at what they can do. Okay, I got no problem with that. I know people who feel that way about Cam Ward. I know people who feel that way about Shedeur Sanders. I have no problem with those kind of opinions, especially if you're selling the prospect on the strength of the prospect. But don't try to sell me the prospect on the strength of, well, what if you miss out? Look, I think the Browns should take Abdul Carter at number 2 overall. What I am not sitting here and doing is saying, hey, the Browns should take Abdul Carter at number 2 overall because what if he's good and you miss out on him? I'm saying, look at what Abdul Carter can do. Look what the vision can be on defense with him. Look how dominant you could be on the defensive line with another piece that can move like Myles Garrett moves on that line. That is a prospect I truly believe in to be the number 2 overall pick. I'm not trying to sell you on the ideal of like, oh, what if he's good and we don't take him and we take somebody who's not as good? I don't care about that. You're drafting prospects. You're not drafting hope. You're not drafting the fear of missing out. Right? I think a lot of people want to draft the quarterback because they want a couple of months of feeling good. And that's what'll happen. Browns draft the quarterback. We'll feel good from May, or at least some of us will feel good about the quarterback position from May until September. And then once September hits, who knows how you're going to feel. You might feel worse than you felt before about the quarterback position. It is not guaranteed. And that is the issue with how Ben frames this, right? Cam Ward and Shador Sanders are not guaranteed things to be anything. We're just talking about the fear of missing out. And I don't think that's a good reason to draft the quarterback number 2 overall. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.